Good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And we are especially delighted this morning to welcome our esteemed guest, Father James Martin. He is a Jesuit priest, a writer, an editor-in-large at America Magazine, an advocate for LGBTQ Catholics. So many titles we could add in your biography. Most recently, he is the author of Come Forth, the Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, about which he'll be speaking today, and copies are available if you're here in person at our bookstore, and there are actually even some copies available in the room. We also have one of his previous books, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, which is mentioned in Come Forth as well. So if you're interested in either of those books, please see Richard at the back of the room, and he'll be happy to help you purchase one. Father Martin, it really is a joy and an honor to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Why
don't I turn it on? How's that? Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. I also want to add another title to that long list of titles, which is Former Neighbor. From 1982 to 1984, I worked next door at the former GE building. 570 Lex, which, as you know, was constructed to, in a sense, complement the architecture of St. Bart's. And for one glorious year, I worked on the 15th floor on this side, and so my window was the dome of St. Bart's. So it's wonderful to come back and be in this beautiful space. I know we have limited time, so I'm going to talk about very briefly the story of Lazarus and how it helps us to experience new life. Normally I read the gospel story, but that would take about half of our time. I'm sure you know the story of Lazarus. He's the brother of Martha and Mary, two of Jesus's close friends. He falls ill. The sisters send word to Jesus that he whom you love is ill. Very interesting title. Not Lazarus, our brother, Lazarus, your disciple, Lazarus of Bethany, but he whom you love. Jesus waits a couple of days, then comes to the tomb. The sisters greet him and say, if you had been here, Lord, our brother would not have died. He says, where have you laid him? They say, come and see. This is John's gospel, so of course that's Jesus' first invitation to the disciples, right? Come and see. They take him to the tomb. He says, take away the stone. Martha protests, says there will be a stench. He calls forth, he calls from he prays, and then he says at the mouth of the tomb, Lazarus, come forth. The dead man comes out, to everyone's amazement. It is normally called Jesus' greatest miracle, and one of the first questions, though, I had from people is, why are you writing a whole book on Lazarus? My mom said to me, Lazarus? A whole book on Lazarus? What is there to say? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about where the book came from and what I'm trying to do with it. Why Lazarus? Well, when I was a young boy, maybe some people will remember this, those of a certain age. Do you remember the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth on TV, Franco Zeffirelli? It would air every Christmas and Easter on network TV. Shows you how things have changed in the past. And it was the raising of Lazarus, that's Robert Powell as Jesus, the raising of Lazarus that for me was the undisputed high point of that story, dwarfing even the resurrection of Jesus, which they didn't show. In the movie, the story happens just as I describe, and Robert Powell stands in front of the tomb and calls out in a very plummy British accent, Lazarus, come forth. Because as you know, Jesus went to Oxford, we all know that. And the dead man comes out. And for a long time, I thought, who is this guy? I didn't know very much about the Gospels, and I didn't go to a Catholic school or any sort of religious school. And so for a long time, Jesus of Nazareth was my introduction to the New Testament. And it made me wonder, who is this guy? Who is Lazarus? Who are these sisters that speak so bluntly to Jesus? And what happens to Lazarus afterwards? So that set me on a sort of lifelong, I would say, curiosity about this man and this story. Many years later, after I left GE and entered the Jesuits, I started to do pilgrimages to the Holy Land. The first time I went to the Holy Land, someone said to me, "Do you want to visit the tomb of Lazarus?" And I said, "What? that you can do that?" And he said, "Sure." And believe it or not, in Bethany, see, Lazarus' tomb, in Bethany, today in Palestinian territory called Al-Azariah, can you hear that? Al-Azariah, the place of Lazarus, is what is pretty much, I'd say, 90% sure, we're 90% sure that this is Lazarus' tomb. It's a first century tomb that has been venerated since the early days of the church in Bethany, which would be where Martha and Mary were. So the first time I went into the tomb, it was very powerful. I was all by myself, and I started to think, well, what am I going to do in this kind of dark, damp, cold space? And what came to mind was, what do I want to leave behind in the tomb? Right? And that's the question the book asks. What do I want to let go of? What keeps me stuck or bound or unfree, right? What prevents me from hearing God's voice in my life? So there were a lot of things. So I had that kind of invitation to do that in prayer at the tomb. It was very powerful, and to imagine God saying to me, "Come forth," which is really what I think God says to us every day of our lives. Later, I brought pilgrims to Bethany on pilgrimages, and as you probably know, not everything that works for you spiritually worked for somebody else. And I thought, well, I'll give them this meditation. Imagine going into the tomb and leaving something behind. And it was very powerful for a lot of people. A lot of them came out in tears, right? So I thought, I think it's important for me to write about this. By the way, this is what Al-Azariah looks like. I have a lot of images in the book, which I was very happy to include. That's the Church of St Lazarus. We don't normally say that in the United States, but he is a saint, along with Martha and Mary, St. Lazarus. And if you can see, I know it's a little hard to see, but on the front of the church are Lazarus, Martha, and Mary in big mosaics. Going down into the tomb, there aren't many pictures of this. I was happy to have this. That's going down into the tomb of Lazarus, which is about 2 floors down. And this is what the tomb looks like. So there would have been the bodies in the niches, right? And then once the bodies had decayed, they would be put into ossuaries, right? The kind of small boxes for bones. So that's the spot that I was praying in and all the pilgrims pray in. So the book really is a deep dive into the story of the raising of Lazarus. It's really in 4 parts, all of them included in each chapter. 1, a kind of biblical exegesis of what's going on in the story, right? What is happening in this story, sometimes almost line by line. Second, a sort of travelogue. What would you see if you went to Bethany today? What is it like? Third, the sort of spiritual approach, which is, what does the story of Lazarus have to say to us today, right? I mean, we believe that Christ called Lazarus into new life, but what does it have to say to us today? And again, it's that theme of letting things go and imagining Jesus calling us to new life. And then finally, a kind of cultural history of Lazarus. Lazarus in the fine arts, in poetry, in film. He shows up quite frequently, actually, and so that was kind of fun to unearth. But a few things about Lazarus. First of all, that's an image from Father Bill McNichols, who is a Catholic iconographer. It's called Lazarus of Bethany. The first question is, did Lazarus exist? It's a pretty important question. And scholars remind us, New Testament scholars remind us, that when people outside of the 12 apostles are named, there's a reason for it. So if you think about it, basically when Jesus heals people, it's often the woman with the hemorrhage, right? Or a man with leprosy, or 10 lepers, right? But oftentimes people are named. So we have Nicodemus, and of course Mary Magdalene, and Joanna, and Susanna, right? We have these proper names. New Testament scholars tell us that when people outside the 12 are named, it's because the early church knew them, right? So it wasn't just a man that came from a crowd who receded after his healing. but it was someone that was known to the early church. And so presumably, when, as we know, there's 3 stages to the writing of the Gospels. There's the events themselves, right? But then there's the oral tradition, right? Let's say between AD 30 or 33, when after Jesus leaves the earth, and the writing of Mark's Gospel, which is around AD 65. There's the oral tradition. And then there's the writing of the Gospels after Mark and all the way till John. Presumably, in that time of the oral tradition, if someone had said, "Oh, Jesus raised this guy," they would have said, "Yeah, Lazarus. Tell him his name." They knew Martha and Mary and Lazarus. One of the questions, though, is these are some. Actually, that's up at the cloisters. There's Lazarus, and there's Jesus healing a blind man. One of the big questions is, why is the gospel story of the raising of Lazarus not in the other gospels? Did you ever think about that? That kind of bothered me when I was a kid. I mean, if it is Jesus' greatest miracle, right? Why is it not in the synoptics in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And a lot of people, that sort of distances them from the story, that it's only in John. But a couple of interesting insights I found when I was researching this book. The Synoptic Gospels are mainly concerned with Galilee in the north, right? And John's Gospel is more focused on Judea. And if you think about it, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, already have traditions of Jesus raising people from the dead, right? We generally think of just Lazarus when we think of, who did Jesus raise from the dead? Lazarus, but also the daughter of Jairus, remember, the synagogue official, right, whom he raises from the dead, and the son of the widow of Nain, remember her, right? Jesus sees a funeral procession. So the Synoptic Gospels, and there's a little bit of I would say, not competition, but a little bit of a tension between, say, the beloved disciple, around whom John's Gospel is written, and Peter, right? So you can see that the Synoptic Gospels didn't need that story of Lazarus, right? And also they are focusing more on Galilee. But there's an interesting connection between the Gospels. In Luke's Gospel, remember the story of Lazarus and Dives? Remember that? The poor man and the rich man? So the story is that there's a rich man, and outside his gate, a poor man named Lazarus is lying there. The dogs would come and lick at his sores. The poor man ignores him. They both go to the afterlife, and of course the poor man is doing well. The rich man not so well. And then the rich man says to Abraham, to Father Abraham, "Tell Lazarus to go back to warn my brothers, that I should take care of the poor," right? And now normally it's seen as a kind of sort of image or a presage of Jesus, right? Because Abraham says even if someone went back from the dead, they wouldn't believe him, right? And so people think, oh, well, they're talking about Jesus, which is, probably true. But what we have to see is that here's a parable in Luke's Gospel where a man named Lazarus is coming back from the dead. So New Testament scholars today say it's the only parable, isn't this interesting? It's the only parable where someone has a proper name. So a man had 2 sons, right? Or a woman sweeping for a coin, right? It's the only parable where someone has a proper name. So New Testament scholars tell us that most likely Luke knew of the tradition of Lazarus in John's Gospel. So there are these kind of internal proofs. Another interesting question about Lazarus, that's a picture called The Beloved Disciple, which I talk about in the book, is Lazarus as the beloved disciple. So it's kind of tantalizing. I was out with a friend of mine named Michael Peppard, who's a New Testament scholar at Fordham, and I was working on the book and talking about Lazarus with Michael, and he said, well, as scholars often do, very polite scholars will use this expression, you will find, which is, well, I'm sure you know, which I love, I'm sure you know of all the scholarship that talks about Lazarus as the beloved disciple. I said, no, what are you talking about? And he kind of outlined it. Now, most of it comes from a scripture scholar you probably know, Ben Witherington III, who is a wonderful New Testament scholar. And he has laid out the case for Lazarus as the beloved disciple. Now, who is the beloved disciple? Well, the beloved disciple is the one who is seen as the source for many of the stories in John's gospel, right? And yet he's a very mysterious figure. Some people think it's the evangelist himself, right? Some people think it's the Apostle Thomas. Some people have said it's Mary Magdalene, right? I think that's unlikely because on the cross, Jesus says to the beloved disciple, "Son, here is your mother, mother, here is your son." So that's less likely. She's important in her own right, but probably not the beloved disciple. But lately, people have been saying it's Lazarus. Now, I found that fascinating, so I do a little detective work in the book. Why could it be Lazarus? Well, first of all, Lazarus is called in that story in John 11, "He whom you love," okay, the beloved one. And the beloved disciple doesn't make his appearance in John's gospel until after John 11. Isn't that interesting? The beloved disciple is nowhere before John 11. So it is as if the story of Lazarus is the introduction to the beloved disciple, right? One of the strongest arguments for the beloved disciple as Lazarus is in John 21. And in John 21, remember at the breakfast by the sea, remember when the risen Christ appears to the disciples? He has that interchange with St. Peter, remember, right? Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Remember, that's to counterbalance Peter's triple denial at the crucifixion. And then, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Feed my sheep." And then at the end, it's the strangest question. Peter says, the beloved disciple is standing next to him. Peter says, "What about him?" I often use this on retreats to remind people to stop checking out somebody else, focus on Jesus in your own life, stop comparing, right? "What about him, Lord?" And Jesus says, "Well, if it is my desire," I'm paraphrasing, "that he should remain alive until I come again, what business is this of yours?" And John's gospel says, because of that, the rumor arose that this disciple would not die. Now, that makes sense about no one except Lazarus. Why would they say some Galilean fisherman is not going to die? So it makes sense about Lazarus. There's a lot of internal proofs for this. One of the most beautiful things is when the beloved disciple gets to the tomb, he looks in, remember, on Easter Sunday, and he sees and believes. What does he see? He sees the grave cloths rolled up, and the head covering, the sudarion, all rolled up. The last time we heard anything about grave cloths or even the word sudarion, the head covering, was in the story of Lazarus. Lazarus looks into the tomb and sees the empty grave cloths and knows because he's been raised from the dead. Raymond Brown, the great New Testament scholar, said, which I love, that Jesus comes out without his grave clothes, right? They're in the tomb. He's not going to need his anymore. Lazarus comes out wearing his. He's going to need them again. Isn't that beautiful? So beautiful parallel. Now, Lazarus is not the only person I talk about in the book. I know we're going to be close for time. I do want to spend time, though, on Mary and Martha. One of the wonderful things about Mary and Martha, that's a Vermeer, by the way, is how their characters mirror one another in both Luke's presentation of them and John's. So here's the famous story in Luke where Mary and Martha are hosting Jesus in what is called Martha's house, by the way, not Lazarus's house. And by the way, one of the great things about writing is that when I send my book to scholars and experts, I get all these wonderful insights. And I sent it to a woman named Amy Jill Levine. Maybe has she spoken here yet? Yeah, she's amazing. She's amazing. She is a Jewish New Testament scholar. So she wrote back and she said to me, I talked about the meal in Luke's gospel, right, which we see portrayed. And she said, there's no meal in that. Why are you putting a meal? I think she said something like, dear, there's no meal in that. She's very playful. And I said, yes, there is. Of course there is. That's ridiculous. So I went back and I looked in Luke's gospel. No. What Martha complains to Jesus about is, Lord, don't you care that I'm doing all the diakonia, all the ministry, all the work? And Amy Jill suggested that the reason we have, as she said, relegated Martha to peeling potatoes is we didn't like the idea of diakonia and Martha being linked together. Very interesting. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. In Luke's gospel, Martha is portrayed, at least in this scene, as the active one, right? She is active. Mary is portrayed as more contemplative. This is Mary and Martha of Bethany, also by Bill McNichols. And those characters are very vivid. Now, we could talk a lot about action and contemplation. I think that, unfortunately, that story has been used to kind of denigrate the active life. How many times have people said, maybe people working in this parish that said, oh, Martha, Martha, stop working so hard, right? But, someone has to do the work, right? I think it's basically saying that there's a time and a place for everything. But their characters, one being active, one being contemplative, are mirrored in John's story, where what does Martha do? Martha rushes out to meet Jesus, right? And says that great line, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. While Mary stays behind, more contemplative, right? Until Martha says the teacher is calling you. And then she rushes out to see Jesus, and what does she do? She falls at his feet, right? She falls at his feet in John's gospel, which is what she does. And she's at Jesus' feet in Luke's gospel. So these are people with very strong personalities who, even in those short gospel readings, their personalities come through. And one thing, I don't want to go too long. We could talk forever about Lazarus. But one thing I do want to say is that that's a mosaic in the Church of St Lazarus of the visit of Martha and Mary. One thing I think is really interesting, and maybe we can end on this, is how this story of Martha and Mary reminds us of the need for intimacy with Jesus in prayer, with God in prayer. Martha is very blunt with Jesus in Luke's gospel. She says, Lord, don't you care? Who talks to Jesus like that? Except the disciples in the boat, right? Don't you care we are drowning? Don't you care that I'm doing all this diakonia myself? And then in John's gospel, she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's a profession of faith. It's a little bit of a rebuke, too. How is she able to be so honest with Jesus? Well, because she knows him, right? We're only honest with people like that we know, right? And it's a reminder of the need for intimacy in prayer, which the honesty leads to more intimacy, which leads to more honesty. When I was over at the Synod in Rome last year, the Vatican Synod, a lot of people said to me, you need to tell Pope Francis this. And I said, well, first of all, I don't talk to Pope Francis like that. And so that's a good insight. Like, I would never talk to Pope Francis, you need to do this, right? But maybe people who know him better do. So that's a sense of how open and honest Mary and Martha were with Jesus. And it's just a reminder of the need for honesty in prayer. Now I'm going to flip ahead a little bit, and I'm going to say that the theme of the book, just to kind of round it out, I got a lot more pictures. The theme of the book really is, what are the things in our lives, right, in our spiritual lives, in our daily lives, that keep us from hearing the voice of Jesus? Maybe it's a resentment or a grudge or a disappointment. Maybe it's an unhealthy pattern of living, right? You're always we're in New York, you're always sarcastic, or you're angry, or you're bitter or something, right? Are there things that we can leave behind in, I see some people laughing about that. Are there things that we can leave behind in the tomb? Right? Can we let those things die? That's part of dying to self, right? And hear the voice of Jesus calling to us and saying to us, come forth into new life. Because I think that is the message of this story. Not simply that Jesus is, as he says to Martha and Mary, the resurrection and the life. That is who he is. It's one of his great I am statements in John's gospel, the ego and me statements. But that in our daily lives, it's always, we always have to listen to the invitation to let go of things that keep us bound or unfree. And one more thing, just to wrap up. I think one of the most beautiful things, this is John August Swanson. One of the most beautiful parts of this story, just two little things. At the end of the story, Jesus says to the crowd, "Take away the stone." And then at the very end, he says, "Untie him and let him go." Do you ever wonder about that? Now, Jesus could have just, snapped his fingers and Lazarus could have just appeared, right? He could have appeared fully clothed or naked or whatever. But my sense was that Jesus is asking the crowd to participate in the freeing of Lazarus. So the story is not just about us. It's about how we are called to remove the stones, right, from other people's lives that keep them stuck, right? And also to unbind them, to let them go. So that's a little bit of a précis of the book. By the way, I wanted to apologize. I'm going to be wearing a mask afterwards. My mom's immunocompromised, and I try to be careful, so that's why the mask. Anyway, that's the book. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much,
Sure,
Father
my pleasure.
Martin. And we have plenty of time for questions. If you're here in the room, you can fill out a question card. Conrad Tinney in the back has them. Just raise your hand and he'll come around and bring you a question card. If you're joining us online, you can type your question into the live chat on YouTube, the comment section on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Email also works if you're here in the room. A lot of questions have been submitted already.
I'm also very impressed that you publicly say your email address. That's very brave. That's very brave.
I'm sure you've learned that the hard way. I wonder if we can start, you mentioned people asked why write a whole book on Lazarus. And on the one hand, these 45 verses are chock full of so many iconic moments, Jesus weeping, I am the resurrection and the life. On the other hand, you're writing a whole book just on 45 verses. Can you talk a little bit about your method and how you gleaned so much meaning from such a short passage of text?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I've been thinking about it, as I said, for a long time, so I felt like there was a lot to say. It was originally supposed to be a short book. My model was Henry Nouwen's book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, to take one gospel passage and just sort of, exegete it in a sense. But when I started, I realized there's so much in each part and almost in each sentence that it got longer and longer. My method was to really focus on one passage at a time and just do a deep dive in terms of the Greek and in terms of the scholarship. Then I added in the other parts, the spirituality, the travelogue, and then the, what's the other part? Well, the biblical part, the spirituality, the travel, and the cultural part. And, one of the fun things was really to kind of look through some of these images, and there's, that's from the Last Temptation of Christ. That's Lazarus getting killed by Saul. And so it was sort of beginning with the exegetical stuff and then layering on the other parts. I really had a lot of fun. I really, if I were doing anything else, I think I'd be a scripture scholar. I mean, it was really enjoyable, and I think I read the other thing was there's not a lot of single books written on Lazarus, so I was trying to kind of pull together a lot of commentary and a lot of stuff that was sort of out there but not brought together before.
And like Nouwen's book on the prodigal son, you also look to artwork, and in your case, literature, details that are not explicit in the scripture itself to illuminate what is in scripture. Can you talk about why you made that choice?
You mean in terms of
looking at artwork and other cultural things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never been asked that. Why would I include that? I've been influenced so much by film and by different works of art. I put some of my favorites in here. Towards the end, I'll show you some that are in the book. I just found them fascinating. So this is the earliest depiction of Lazarus. It's in the catacombs. It's 2nd or 3rd century. Jesus has a wand, which I find fascinating. And then this is Giotto in the Scrovani Chapel. And if you can see, one of the things I really love is in almost every portrayal of Lazarus, including in kind of Orthodox icons, there's someone holding his or her nose because of the stench. See that guy? In almost every one. So I found it was interesting to see how the story had influenced different generations, different artists. And I think we can learn a lot just visually, too. It's also fun to have pictures in your book. my editor told me when you have a picture in a book, people turn the page and you go, oh, I only have a half a page to read. How wonderful.
Someone wonders why you call this Jesus' greatest miracle.
Yeah, someone said to me, I get sort of great questions like that, and someone said, I'm not laughing at the question, I'm laughing at this other question which I found amusing, which was, who got to decide that? As if there's like a contest or something. It is traditionally called Jesus' greatest miracle, so that's not something I came up with. And in a sense, it is seen as, by many people, dwarfing the other miracles, the healing, because the giving of life was seen as kind of the greatest thing Jesus would do. Also, it's a kind of dramatic high point. The Gospel of John is divided into two parts. There's the book of signs. In John's Gospel, it's signs, not miracles, right, to help us believe. And then there's the book of glory. And the book of glory is the second part. And what is the glory in John's Gospel? As you know, it's Jesus' crucifixion, that because it is his obedience to the Father. And Lazarus' story culminates the book of signs. So it is the greatest in John's Gospel of his signs. Interestingly, in John's Gospel, that is what leads to, as you know, and you probably all know, what leads to the crucifixion. In the Synoptics, it's the cleansing of the temple, which you would think, well, that's interesting. But in John's Gospel, it's Lazarus' being raised from the dead, because immediately, as John describes it, people plot against him. And Ben Witherington had a really interesting point, which is that the reception of Jesus on Palm Sunday, right, that kind of ecstatic reception, right, makes more sense if he's just raised Lazarus from the dead. Isn't that interesting? So cleansing the temple, and then the next thing that Jesus is kind of welcomed into the city. But the fact that it just makes more sense to me that this dramatic miracle, which would have gotten around, and Jesus coming from Bethany, right? It all sort of fits in. But in any event, his greatest miracle. This is not something I came up with. So
we received a question from someone who also pointed out that by raising Lazarus, Jesus sets in motion his own death. And this person wonders if you can speak some to the relationship between self-sacrifice and miracles.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I'd have to think about that second part. But the first part, yes, Jesus' raising of Lazarus sets in motion his own death. And so there's a very interesting death-life pattern here. So Lazarus' death leads to new life, Lazarus' new life, Jesus as the life, which leads to Jesus' death, which leads to new life. But yeah, Jesus, I think one of the reasons, I talk about this in the book, one of the reasons he weeps at the tomb, there's a whole lot of scholarship about what's really going on, is probably not it's probably not simply the traditional rendering of it, which is that he's sad. Right, so Jesus wept, and Jesus began to weep. People really focus on that, oftentimes in funeral homilies and sermons. And certainly he could have been sad for the death of his friend and sad with Martha and Mary and the other mourners. But the Greek is actually, he's angry. He's disturbed. And scholars say that may be because of people's lack of faith, right? The Greek is really interesting. But also his own emotions intuiting, right? This is Jesus fully human and fully divine, so it's probably some divine foreknowledge, but also his human intuition, that this would lead to his own death. And so his deep emotions, he is greatly disturbed or greatly perturbed or deeply moved, may also have been, in a sense, knowing that his own act would lead to kind of a self-sacrifice. Yeah, great question.
Why didn't anyone ask Lazarus what it was like being dead?
Lazarus, one of the things I like of these images that sort of transfer the story to modern times. That's 19th century German. And also, while we're up here, do you guys know Henry Osawa Tanner, who did that great Annunciation? He's an African-American artist, and the Annunciation with Mary, and kind of the angel is a pillar of light. Well, he also did a Lazarus, and that's his Lazarus. There's Lazarus down there. I forgot the question. Say it again. Sorry.
Why didn't anyone ask Lazarus what it was like being dead?
Yeah. So what reminded me and what sort of took me off a little bit was in a lot of fictional versions of the story in plays and poetry. There's a lot of them actually, and then there are a couple novels. There's one called The Gospel According to Lazarus, and another one called Lazarus is Dead. Try to sort of flesh this out. He frequently is asked, and he's mad that Jesus brought him back. So, which I think is kind of funny. Like, I was okay. Why did you bring me back into this kind of crummy body? But Lazarus has no words to speak in the Gospels, which is very interesting. There are a couple theories about this, particularly if he's the beloved disciple. That's an argument against the fact that he's the beloved disciple, that he doesn't speak. In John's Gospel, the focus is always on Jesus, right? And in a sense, it doesn't matter what Lazarus says. The focus is on Jesus, and that this may, as it says in the Gospels, help you come to believe, right? At the end, people come to believe in Jesus. That's the point of the signs. There's some speculation, though, which I find really interesting, and I put in the book, that Martha and Mary and Lazarus might have been people who suffered from leprosy. There's a little connection to Mary when she anoints Jesus' feet in the house of Simon the leper, which may be their father, right? Bethany, Bethania in Aramaic and Hebrew, can be translated in many ways. One is house of affliction. And some people think perhaps, this is all very speculative, but it's worth thinking about, that Martha, Mary, and Lazarus might have been lepers, right, or people with leprosy, living far outside of the precincts of Jerusalem, outside the precincts of the temple, right? And other people think Lazarus might have been disabled, which is, extremely speculative, right? But why is it Martha's house and not Lazarus's house? Why do Martha and Mary always speak? For the Gospels, they speak a lot, and Lazarus says nothing. So that's very speculative, though. But it is true. We don't know what Lazarus thinks. There are some, towards the end of the book, I talk about theories of where Lazarus ended up. But we don't know. I mean, when we get to heaven, we can ask Lazarus what it was like, but not till then.
What do you make of the proposal by scholars that Martha is actually Mary Magdalene?
So there's a scholar named Elizabeth Schrader who's wonderful, and I talk about her in the book. It's kind of complicated, but basically, for the longest time, we've been told not to confuse Mary of Bethany, right, with Mary Magdalene, two different people. By the way, interesting, I also found this out. It's obviously scholars know it. Did you know that Mary Magdalene is never called Mary of Magdala in the Gospels? Now, we always say Mary of Magdala. It's almost like an alternative title. She's always, if my Greek is right, Mariam Legomenos Magdalena, Mary who is called the Magdalene. And that doesn't mean she's from Magdala or Migdal. Magdalene means tower. And so some people believe that Mary Magdalene means Mary the Tower, Mary the Strong One, almost a nickname that Jesus would have given her. Isn't that interesting? Elizabeth Schrader has found that in some texts, she does what's called textual criticism. This is far beyond me. She's a PhD. She's at Villanova now. She has found that in many of the Lazarus stories, Martha has been added. Martha has been added, and she believes that Martha is a later addition, right? And why is that? She believes that Mary of Bethany could be Mary Magdalene. I hope I'm summarizing what her scholarship is. And it was too much for people at the time to think that Mary Magdalene would have been the one who was Lazarus' sister and to whom Jesus would have said, I am the resurrection and the life. would have been the first one at the tomb, and so on and so forth. And so they put the sister in to kind of make it a little less focused on Mary. So that's like leading edge scholarship. So, it's funny, I had about, I explained that in about 3 or 4 pages. I find this kind of biblical stuff just utterly fascinating. I had about 3 or 4 pages of my book. It was originally about 20 pages. And my publisher said, you need to cut that out. It's, it's interesting for scholars, right? But you need to kind of combine it a little bit. So, but I'd encourage you to look at Elizabeth Schrader's work, which is really fascinating.
And just so you all know, Professor Schrader will be here on July 28th.
There you go.
So you'll have a chance to hear from her.
You will hear from her.
Mark your
fascinating.
calendar.
She's fascinating.
Yeah. You mentioned the question of did Lazarus exist? What do historical Jesus scholars, those who care about what's authentic in the Gospels, have to say about the content of this passage?
Yeah, they even if you look at people like John Meyer or Brendan Byrne, they will say that if you look at the sort of construction, you can see signs of what they call, one scholar calls stitching and pasting. So, for example, at the beginning, I think it's Martha and her sister, then it's Mary and her sister. So it looks like it's been sort of edited, which means that there is an original story that sort of pre-exists all these stories. And again, this idea that they're named is a really strong argument for its historicity. And that pretty much all historical Jesus scholars say there was a story that existed about Lazarus that goes back to the very beginning, which I was happy to see. I was worried that I was going to say, like, oh, it never happened, but yeah. And then, of course, there's that connection to Luke's gospel again, right? The naming of Lazarus and Dives, yeah.
Last week we read the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. I think you all did too. How does that story compare and contrast to this one?
Yeah, great question. I don't have a picture of that, but so remember Jairus' daughter, and in the middle of it is the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage. I think one of the interesting things about the 3 raising from the dead stories, so it's Jairus' daughter, the widow of Nain, and Lazarus, is that now we have to be clear that these are in different gospels, but there's a kind of progression of like from easiest to hardest, I would say. So remember, in the story of Jairus, people say, now she's just died, right? Because Jairus comes and says, my daughter is at the point of death, come and heal her. The woman with the hemorrhage is healed. And then he gets to the house, and they mock Jairus, and they say, why are you bothering the teacher? She's already dead. Jesus says she's not dead, she's asleep. They mock him, they make fun of him. He goes in and he raises her. So she has, I will say, just died, okay? The son of the widow of Nain, right, Nain is a town in Galilee, still there, has died and is on the funeral procession, on the bier, and Jesus raises him from that. Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. So the stakes are really high. And, as Jesus says to Thomas, which is the name of one of these fictional books, which is really blunt, Lazarus is dead. And one of the questions is, of course, why does he wait so long? Why does he wait 2 days in the place where he was? Accordingly, though he loved Martha and Mary, he stayed where he was for 2 days. Very interesting. A couple theories about that. One, the theological explanation is that in John's gospel, Jesus is always in command. He'll go when he goes, right? He's in charge. St. John Chrysostom said that he's giving Lazarus something better than just healing, right? He's giving him life. But most likely, and maybe Elizabeth Schrader and A.J. Levine will agree with this, at the time, the Jewish belief was that the soul hovered around the body for 2 or 3 days, right? And so he wants to show people, in a sense, he's dead. He's really dead. And so I think those 3 stories sort of work together as a whole. By the way, interestingly, at least to me, Jesus, when John the Baptist asks remember when John the Baptist is in jail and he sends his emissaries to Jesus to say, "Are you the one who is to come?" Jesus doesn't say yes or no. He says, "Just go and tell John what's going on and what you see. The lame walk, the blind see, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised," which I have to say I didn't really key in on until this book. I mean, Jesus himself says, "I am raising people from the dead." So all that kind of ties together.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to try to fit 2 or 3 more questions in. What practical wisdom is there in this text for those of us who are grieving?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think a couple things. For those of us who are grieving loved ones, Jesus tells us that there is life after death for us. He tells us, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," right? He tells those who believe in me will never die, all right? He shows us this in the raising of Lazarus. This is a Cameroon image. So he shows us this, and then he reveals it to us definitively in his own resurrection. So that's the first thing, that there is something more that is awaiting us, right? And Lazarus has a little bit of a taste of that. He is the resurrection, and he is life. But also that Jesus is with us in our suffering, that Jesus is not afraid to go to the tomb. I think one of the most beautiful insights, I forget where I read it, is that when Martha says, "Don't take the stone away, there will be a stench," very practical. Martha's very practical, right? Which I love. That doesn't bother Jesus. He is okay with being with our stench, in a sense, being with our difficult emotions, being in our sadness, which I think is so beautiful, right? He wants to encounter us even in the difficult moments of our lives and, really bring us to, this is new life. That's a really pretty image. So he promises us new life. He shows it to us in the raising of Lazarus. He reveals it to us in his own resurrection, and he's also with us in our suffering.
Towards the end of this pericope, Jesus calls out to the Father and prays, "Father, I know that you hear me, but for the benefit of the crowd." What do you make of that moment?
It's a very strange locution, isn't it? It's like, but it's a kind of reminder, I think, to the crowd. Really, he's in John's gospel. He's always trying to get people to believe that God is with him, and then also, he is going to do something that's really dramatic, and he is calling on the Father's help. Remember, in the story of the woman with the hemorrhage, he feels power go out of him. Remember, which is really quite unusual. I think that's one of the only places where that's said. So he also may himself be praying for strength. So not simply on account of the crowd, but himself to kind of unite himself with the Father in this great thing that he's going to do. Yeah, it's a very mysterious locution.
Final question. In the book, you mentioned that the original title was Come Out, and you changed it to Come Forth. I wonder if you can reflect on why you made that decision and what connections, if any, this story has with some of the other work you do.
Sure. Very nicely put. So in the Greek is douro exo, right? Douro, come, exo. So exo means out. All right, so an exodus, right? Hodos is a road. An exodus is a road out. When Jesus casts out demons, I'm no Greek scholar, but I love the Greek. It's ekbalein. He throws them out. So douro exo means come out. The come forth, which I liked originally from that Franco Zeffirelli film, Come Forth, is certainly more dramatic, and that's the one that I kind of grew up on. But I also, I do a lot of work with LGBTQ people, and I know people laugh when I say this, but I said to my publisher, if I call this book Come Out, people are going to get the wrong idea, right? They're going to think it's about LGBTQ stuff. But it is Come Out, and that's actually what's in the New American Bible, Come Out. This story has great resonances and great meanings for LGBTQ people who often have to leave behind in the tomb what keeps them bound or unfree, and which is often people telling them that they're a mistake or they're wrong or they're evil or they're disgusting, right? And so the come out, of course, coming out in common parlance, means, being honest about your sexuality, your identity. So the story is really powerful for LGBTQ people, and I think really has a lot to say to them about leaving behind things that don't work, right? And listening to God call them into new life, right? Into who they are. And at the same time, I also think, as I said before, that we need to participate in the freeing of LGBTQ people, right? We need to take away the stones that keep them, right, from being who they are. We need to unbind them and let them go. But if I called it "Come Out," I think people would have thought it was about something else. So thus it is. And I think this is really kind of beautiful for me. The very first time I saw the story, way back when. Let's see if we can go all the way back. Was when this guy said, "Come forth." And so for me, that's that phrase is just so powerful. Yeah. So I just want to say thanks. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm happy to see you afterwards. I apologize for the mask again. And I would encourage you to hear Jesus' voice in your own life saying, "Come forth," or "Come out."
Please join me in thanking Father Martin. As we end, a few reminders. Richard is in the back selling books, so if you'd like a copy of Come Forth or Jesus a Pilgrimage, you can receive one from Richard. And we hope that those of you who would like to will join us for worship following the service at 11 a.m. in the church or online at stbarts.org. Next week at the Forum, I'll be gone for 2 weeks on vacation, but my colleague Meredith will be here with the former Bishop of Botswana, Trevor Mumwaba. So see you then.